The summer of 1945 hung heavy over the Pacific like a wound that refused to close. Japan had surrendered, but surrender didn't end fear, it only changed its shape. In a small American-run prisoner-of-war camp on the outskirts of Okinawa, a group of Japanese women waited in silence, uncertain whether the men who guarded them would bring punishment or mercy. The war had stripped them of everything, families, homes, even the idea of tomorrow. Each morning began with the same sound: boots on gravel, a whistle, the clang of metal gates. The women lined up, heads bowed, hands trembling. They expected cruelty. They had been told that capture meant humiliation. Yet the Americans who walked the perimeter carried expressions that were unreadable, neither hatred nor pity, just exhaustion and duty. Inside one of the barracks, the air smelled of disinfectant and wet earth. The women whispered to each other in short fragments of memory, how their cities had burned, how their brothers never came home. One of them, a nurse named Aiko, clutched a small notebook filled with fading sketches of cherry blossoms. She had drawn them to remember the spring before the bombings. Now she drew nothing. Across the fence, Sergeant Thomas Reeves wiped sweat from his forehead. He was 26, from Kansas, a farm boy who had never seen the ocean before the war. The months in the Pacific had aged him decades. He looked at the thin figures in the yard and felt something twist inside his chest. His mother used to bake chocolate cake every Sunday. He could almost smell it, the warm sugar, the cocoa, the forgiveness baked into it. That memory followed him to the camp kitchen, where a few army cooks scraped by with whatever rations they had left. Flour, powdered milk, a tin of cocoa from a Red Cross parcel. Not enough for soldiers, but perhaps enough for a gesture. Reeves watched the cook, Corporal Hendersos. The first bite landed like thunder in their memories. The sweetness was almost painful. It reminded them of school festivals, of family kitchens, of the world before uniforms and ashes. Some whispered prayers. Others just stared at the sky, as if the clouds might understand. Aiko closed her eyes. The chocolate melted on her tongue, and for the first time in months, she felt human. That night, when the camp lights dimmed, the women spoke softly through the dark. No one mentioned soldiers or defeat. They talked about recipes, about ingredients they once used, about mothers and markets and laughter. Across the fence, Reeves sat on an ammunition crate, staring at the stars, wondering what his mother would think if she saw him now, feeding the enemy with her Sunday tradition. In the morning, something unexplainable lingered in the air. The guards greeted the women not with orders but with nods. The fear that once filled the yard had loosened, replaced by an awkward curiosity. One woman shyly bowed toward Reeves. He returned the gesture without words. The war wasn't over. It never truly ends. But for a fleeting moment, both sides had stepped outside of it. The chocolate cake had done what diplomacy could not. It reminded everyone that kindness could survive the ruins. And as the sun climbed higher, its light caught the glint of tin bowls stacked near the fence, each one scraped clean to the last crumb. Morning sunlight poured across the camp like a slow apology. The smell of earth and metal hung in the air, but something intangible had shifted. The women still moved cautiously, yet their eyes searched for the faces of the men who had brought them the impossible dessert. Kindness, once unthinkable, had become a rumor carried in whispers between bunks. Some called it mercy, others a trick of guilt, but no one could deny that the world had tilted. Aiko awoke before the whistle, fingers brushing the edge of her empty tin bowl. She traced the thin line of chocolate that still clung to its surface. For months she had measured life in fear. Now she measured it in sweetness remembered. Beyond the fence, Sergeant Reeves was already at the kitchen, sleeves rolled, jaw set. The night before, he had dreamt of home, of a table where laughter rose louder than radio static. He couldn't shake the image of those women crying over a simple cake. The camp's routine tried to reclaim control. Roll call, chores, rations, silence. But the rhythm was off-beat. When Reeves passed the yard, some of the women looked up instead of down. One even smiled. Henderson, the cook, noticed and muttered, "You've started something, Tom." Reeves shrugged. "Maybe it's worth starting." Rumours reached headquarters by midday. An officer demanded to know why precious cocoa powder had been wasted on prisoners. Reeves stood at attention, heart hammering. "Sir, morale works both ways," he said quietly. "If they stop fearing us, maybe they'll stop hating us." The officer stared, then dismissed him with a wave. Rules bent quietly in the ruins of war. That evening, a Red Cross truck arrived with medical supplies. Among the boxes were bandages, penicillin, and a few tins of condensed milk. Henderson grinned. "Guess fate's on your side." Reeves only nodded, already thinking about what else could be baked, what else could remind them all that the world wasn't only discipline and dirt. Across the fence, the women were mending uniforms when the interpreter approached. He carried a folded paper and read aloud in halting Japanese. "Tomorrow. Small work detail. Kitchen help requested." Silence followed. The kitchen was forbidden ground. For the women, stepping inside meant surrendering the last thread of distance between captive and captor. Yet curiosity overpowered hesitation. Aiko whispered, "If they wanted to hurt us, they would have done it long ago." The next day, 5 women volunteered. The kitchen smelled of flour and soap. Sunlight cut through the slats, turning dust into gold. Reeves watched them enter, each step slow, precise. They bowed awkwardly, unsure of etiquette. Henderson handed one of them a wooden spoon. She flinched, then tightened her grip. The sound of metal bowls clinking echoed like tentative conversation. Iko recognized the ingredients, the same ones she'd studied in textbooks before the war. She had once dreamed of owning a small bakery in Nagasaki. Now she was stirring batter for her former enemies. Yet, as the spoon moved in circles, the tension began to melt. Henderson corrected her posture, she corrected his measurement, and laughter, small, uncertain, escaped between them. The guards outside paused, listening as if they had heard music for the first time in months. By afternoon, the kitchen heat blurred the walls. The women worked silently but efficiently, folding dough, washing pans, arranging rations. Reeves leaned against the doorway, pretending to check the ledger while watching the strange harmony unfold. One of the women, Hana, asked through the interpreter why Americans liked chocolate so much. Reeves smiled. "Because even a little of it can make the world taste better." The translator struggled with the metaphor, but when he finished, Hana nodded solemnly. When the next cake came out of the oven, Reeves didn't order it to the prisoner's yard. Instead, he placed it on the table and motioned for everyone, guards and prisoners alike, to sit. For a few breaths, no one moved. Then Aiko stepped forward, cut a slice, and offered it to Henderson. The gesture reversed the entire order of war. He accepted it, awkwardly, then returned the act, breaking his piece in half to share. The room exhaled. Outside, the wind carried the scent again, rich, unmistakable. Soldiers on patrol stopped to sniff the air. Civilians in nearby villages might have thought it was the smell of peace. Inside the camp, the women tasted the cake they had helped create. It wasn't perfect. The sugar was uneven, the cocoa thin. Yet they chewed slowly, reverently, as though tasting freedom in disguise. Aiko wiped a tear before anyone saw. Reeves pretended not to notice, though his throat burned. He thought of the propaganda posters that had promised hatred eternal and wondered how easily people could be taught to forget each other's faces. Henderson lit a cigarette and said, "You know this'll never make the papers." Reeves answered, "Then it's ours alone." Night settled early. The women returned to their quarters carrying empty bowls but full silence. In the dimness, they spoke of what they had learned, the words the Americans used for sweetness, for laughter, for thanks. They repeated them softly, like prayers. Cake, thank you. home. Aiko wrote them in her notebook beside the fading cherry blossoms. In his tent, Reeves wrote a letter to his mother. He didn't mention regulations or rationing. He only described the look on a young woman's face when she tasted chocolate for the first time in years. Maybe, he wrote, that's how wars actually end. Not with flags, but with small kindnesses that no one orders. He folded the page carefully, knowing it might never reach Kansas, but believing the words mattered anyway. Weeks passed. The camp began to change in invisible ways. Guards spoke more softly. Prisoners volunteered for chores without fear. When the Red Cross officers visited, they found painted signs in both languages marking the kitchens and clinics. Even the dogs stopped barking as often. The tension that once held every breath hostage started to loosen. One morning, Henderson caught Aiko humming an American melody. He frowned. "You know that tune?" Through the interpreter, she answered, "Now I do." The simplicity of it pierced him deeper than he expected. Later, he told Reeves, "Maybe we're teaching them more than language." Reeves replied, "Or maybe they're reminding us what being human sounds like." As the autumn winds approached, orders arrived that the women would soon be transferred to a larger facility for repatriation. The news spread like lightning. Freedom was near, but so was farewell. That evening, Aiko asked the interpreter to deliver a request. Could they bake one last cake before they left? Reeves agreed instantly. The final morning came bright and cold. The kitchen buzzed with quiet energy. Flour dusted every surface like new snow. The women worked with precision. The men followed their rhythm. No one spoke of goodbye, yet every motion carried the weight of it. When the cake was done, they set it on the table and waited. Aiko looked at Reeves. "For you," she said in slow English. He shook his head. "For all of us." They cut it together, the knife sliding through soft layers. Each person took a piece, ate, and remembered the first day. The fear, the smell, the disbelief. Now there was only quiet gratitude. When the convoy arrived to escort the prisoners, the women stood at the gate. Some bowed, some waved shyly. Reeves saluted without words. As the trucks rolled away, a scrap of notebook paper fluttered through the fence. On it were 4 words written in careful Japanese and English: "Cake, peace, thank you, tomorrow." Reeves watched the note catch in the wire before the wind carried it off toward the sea. He thought of the sweetness that had crossed a battlefield and the hearts that had changed in silence. The war would live in textbooks, but this moment would live between them, unrecorded, yet unforgettable. The scent of chocolate faded, but its echo stayed, a memory strong enough to outlast orders, flags, and time itself. Autumn surrendered to winter, and the war's echo drifted farther each day. The camp that had once been filled with tension now stood half empty, its fences humming softly in the cold wind. Sergeant Reeves remained behind with a smaller detail, cleaning the grounds and preparing reports for transfer. Every corner carried the ghosts of voices that had once whispered in fear, and then, miraculously, in laughter. One morning he found the small notebook that Aiko had dropped near the kitchen door, the one with the cherry blossom sketches. Between the pages lay a smear of dried chocolate, faint but unmistakable. He turned the pages carefully, reading English words written in uncertain strokes. "Cake, thank you, tomorrow." He closed the notebook and pressed it against his chest before slipping it into his pack. A telegram arrived from command ordering the dismantling of temporary camps. Reeves stared at the message longer than he needed to. The line between duty and humanity had blurred, and he wasn't ready to redraw it. Henderson noticed and said quietly, "You can't keep a place like this alive. Peace kills its own ghosts." Reeves answered, "Then maybe that's mercy too." The last truck rolled out at dusk. Reeves stayed behind until the sky turned violet. He walked through the empty barracks, remembering faces and voices, the way the women had laughed when flour exploded in the air, the tremor in Aiko's hands when she'd first held a spoon again. The kitchen smelled of ashes now, but beneath it he imagined the sweetness still clinging to the walls. Before leaving, he buried a small tin box under the window where the cakes had cooled. Inside he placed a ration label, a piece of chocolate wrapper, and the note that had drifted through the fence. "So it won't be forgotten," he murmured. Then he turned toward the road that led home. Months later, across the sea, Aiko stood on the pier. Letters began to cross the ocean. Not official correspondence, just fragile envelopes addressed by hand. Some reached their destination, others vanished into bureaucracy, but enough arrived to keep memory alive. Reeves received one on a spring morning in Kansas. Inside was a single drawing, a slice of cake beside a blooming cherry tree. No words, only the date, 1945. He pinned it above his desk and stared at it whenever the world felt divided again. The years that followed carried them both through ordinary lives. Reeves married, raised 2 children, worked the same farmland his father once ploughed. Aiko opened a small bakery near the harbour. She called it Tomorrow's Sweetness. Neither expected their story to matter beyond memory. Yet sometimes, in quiet hours, they each wondered if kindness left ripples big enough for history to notice. Years passed, then decades. The war retreated into textbooks and ceremonies, but its smaller moments, unwritten, unseen, lived quietly inside those who had touched them. In 1965, 20 years after the surrender, a memorial exhibition opened in Tokyo titled Hands Across War. It gathered artifacts from both sides, letters, sketches, and photographs that spoke not of battles but of mercy. Among the displays sat a weather-worn tin box dug up by construction workers on Okinawa. Inside it lay a crumbling ration label, a scrap of chocolate wrapper, and a folded note that read in fading ink, "Cake piece, thank you, tomorrow." Visitors paused before it longer than they did the medals or maps. Some whispered, others wiped their eyes. The curator admitted that no one knew who had buried it, only that the handwriting matched a record from a U.S. field kitchen. In the crowd, a grey-haired woman stopped breathing for a heartbeat. Aiko traced the glass with trembling fingers, recognizing her own uneven script. The sweetness she thought the world had forgot, 10 had survived beneath foreign soil. That night she wrote a letter addressed simply to whoever remembers. She thanked them for proving that kindness could outlive uniform and language. She enclosed a photograph of her bakery, shelves lined with small chocolate cakes crowned by tiny sugar cherry blossoms. When the letter reached the American Veterans Office months later, no one could locate the man she described. Records showed Sergeant Thomas Reeves had died the previous winter, but his daughter found the envelope while sorting his papers. Inside his desk, she discovered a drawing of a cake under a cherry tree, tacked above faded orders. She placed the new photograph beside it and whispered, he'd be glad to know she kept baking. In Japan, Aiko watched the evening tide roll in, the air scented with cocoa and salt. Customers filled her shop, children laughing as they licked frosting from their fingers. She imagined the camp kitchen, the dust, the fear, the warmth of a stranger's gift, and felt peace rather than pain. For her, the war had ended not in 1945, but in every moment someone chose gentleness over vengeance. And somewhere in the endless scroll of history, a small story continued to travel. A teacher shared it with her students, a filmmaker adapted it for a documentary. A viewer across the world paused mid-scroll to watch and stayed until the end. Because the algorithm of humanity, like the one that feeds screens, favors what people linger on, and people linger on kindness. If you listen closely between the lines of headlines and timelines, you can still hear it. The echo of a spoon against a metal bowl, the soft gasp of surprise, the laughter that followed. The scent of chocolate drifting over barbed wire. A reminder that even in the ruins of war, sweetness finds a way to rise.